Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for joining me. What has the reaction been to Michael Moore's film? I mean, I've actually seen some demands that have been pulled from YouTube, demands from green groups.
I mean, it's pretty amazing. We've seen a number of environmental leaders, including environmental documentary filmmakers, demand that the film be taken down from the internet. No one's really laid out a very good case of what the film got wrong. I had some problems with it myself, I mentioned in my piece, but really intense reaction. I mean, the film has over 3 million views already, which is really unheard of for documentary movies in general, especially environmental documentaries. So, I mean, I've gotten a huge amount of email traffic. I think there's just, Michael Moore is our most famous documentary filmmaker. And it's just very surprising because he's just a very left-wing person who people did not expect to issue a movie that was so critical of renewables.
What is the significance of his film, do you think?
I think it marks the beginning of a grand awakening among people that care about the natural environment to the impacts that renewables have. There's something really simple at the heart of this, which is this idea of energy density. Every fuel we use, whether it's wood or coal or natural gas or uranium or sunlight or wind, has an amount of energy in it. And the problem with renewables is that the renewables fuels, so to speak, the flows really, are just very energy dilute. And so what that means is that you have to spread a huge amount of energy collectors, whether in the form of solar panels, mirrors in the desert, wind turbines, over a huge area. And so the land requirements are absolutely enormous. This didn't get explained as well as it needed to in the movie, in my opinion. They sort of attributed the problems with renewables to capitalism or some weird thing, but the problems with renewables exist whether you have a capitalist society or a socialist society. They have to do with the inherent physical nature of renewable energy. So I think it's going to have a big impact. I think it's going to educate a lot of people and send people out looking to learn more, I hope.
But it's interesting, isn't it, Michael, because you've been writing about this for a long time, this problem. Others have been writing about it, talking about it for a long time. But here is Michael Moore suddenly, like road to Damascus conversion. Oh my God, it doesn't actually work. And someone from the left, is that the significance of it, that it really seems to have come from an unexpected quarter, a dose of reality?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's funny when you think about it, like the idea that energy sources would have a politics. In my view, it's just the better energy sources have more energy, they're higher energy density. That means you use less of the natural environment. So I don't think that's a liberal or conservative thing or a left or a right thing. But there is a history here, which is that really after the fall of the Soviet Union, and really started much earlier than that, environmentalists really had this idea of saving the natural environment by returning to an earlier agricultural mode of production. It was very romantic. It never made any sense technically or economically. But I think people really fell in love with the idea. I think people really fell in love with the idea of harmonizing human society with the natural environment. And they felt they could do that with renewables. I think we're now having scaled up enough solar farms and wind farms, as well as biomass, which has just been devastating. Biofuels have been devastating. I think enough of it has now gone on that people can see the real world impact. And it's impossible to just dismiss the people raising these concerns anymore as, climate change deniers, as the language they use, or as right-wingers, or as the fossil fuel lobby. These are usually people who've dedicated their lives to protecting the natural environment. It's often scientists, conservationists, neighbors. So I think that this is, maybe the end of the beginning, or maybe the beginning of the end, but at least a moment of increased awareness of the impacts of renewables.
But the criticism here from some green groups has been, well, Michael Moore's film is dangerous because it doesn't recognise new developments in solar technology, so the panels last a bit longer, and they don't recognise battery improvements so that you can store a little bit more power than perhaps a less devastating cost than is true so far. How much credence do you give to those arguments?
Well, these are really easy arguments to fact check. I did so this morning. An Australian commenter argued that solar panels had become significantly more efficient in converting sunlight into electricity over the last 10 years. Well, I looked it up. The increases have been around 2%, according to the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is both a developer and a promoter of renewables in the United States. So solar panel efficiency doesn't increase at exponential rates. And you got to remember the first crystalline silicon solar panel for modern use was developed in the 1950s. And that's the same design of panel that the Chinese are using. So, I mean, I think that people have to remember is that we can make the panels a little bit more efficient, and you'll see maybe a little bit less land used, but it still takes somewhere around 400 to 500 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity from a solar farm as it does from a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant. That's a huge difference. So even if you were to reduce that land amount by 10%, you're still talking about many hundreds of times more land and at least a dozen times more materials and mining. And our estimates are somewhere between 200 to 300 times more waste is produced from solar panels than from nuclear. So, you know, has there been some progress over the last 10 years? Sure, there's been progress on everything. Has it made a fundamental difference? It hasn't, and it's because the fundamentals of the technology, the fuel, in this case sunlight or wind or wood, are all just energy dilute, and that's never going to change.
Michael Shellenberger, my criticism of the film, as I said last night, was that it still subscribes to that sort of doom, Paul Ehrlich, population bomb kind of thing that I thought we'd grown out of, we'd learned better from 40, 50 years ago, that the planet's running out of resources, we're cockroaches on the planet, that it's all doom and gloom, and there's no real acceptance that there are technological solutions that would keep and advanced economies like yours and ours going. And for instance, it doesn't even discuss nuclear power. That seems to me, the doom message that Michael Moore and the director are pushing, that seems to me the greatest flaw in the movie.
Yeah, I agree with you. The truth is that the movie doesn't present a lot of the information that I think people are really yearning for. I don't think most people realize that Britain, Germany, and France saw their carbon emissions peak in the 1970s. Carbon emissions peaked in the United States and in most developed economies over a decade ago, mostly from the transition from coal to natural gas. In Europe, it was also the transition from coal to nuclear. There's a number of trends that are going in the right direction. Everything's not perfect. There's a lot of human beings on Earth, and we need to do things to make room for other habitats and other species. But we've done amazing things. We're growing so much more food on the same amount of land that the amount of land that we use for meat production, for example, has gone down. We only use 0.5% of the land right now for energy production. But if we were to go to 100% renewables, the amount of land most nations would need to produce that amount of energy would be something closer to 50% of their land. It's never going to happen, of course. There's no way that nations would do that. But I think it gives you a sense that to protect the environment, we need to produce more food and more energy with fewer natural resources. And that means actually moving away from these land-intensive, resource-intensive technologies like renewables and towards things like natural gas and nuclear, which just use much less of the landscape, much less materials, and still can provide for very high standards of living and have proven to provide that for decades.